Just step aside, old man. This isn't your concern. The young Marine's voice dripped with dismissal as he waved off the elderly figure standing nearby. At the Camp Pendleton Rifle Range, 3 junior Marines had been struggling for over 20 minutes with the new M27 infantry automatic rifle system, fumbling with components they'd never seen before. The old man in the worn Vietnam-era jacket watched quietly, his weathered hands steady at his sides. When he assembled the complex weapon in 47 seconds flat, without looking at the manual, every person on that range fell silent. If you believe we should never dismiss someone based on their age, type "respect" in the comments below. His name was Frank Morrison, and most mornings he drove 43 miles from his small apartment in Oceanside just to watch the sun rise over the Pacific from the observation area near the Marine base. At 76 years old, Frank moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body remembered every hard landing, every forced march, every moment that mattered. His hands, gnarled with arthritis but surprisingly steady, had held more rifles than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. But nobody knew that. To the world, he was just another old veteran trying to stay connected to a life that had moved on without him. The morning of November 8th started like any other. Frank had his coffee at the small diner off base, reading the paper, exchanging quiet nods with other regulars who never asked about his past. He'd learned long ago that people weren't really interested in old war stories. They were polite sometimes, but their eyes always drifted away. At 9:30, he made his way to the public observation area, adjacent to the rifle qualification range, a spot where civilians could watch training exercises from behind safety barriers. He liked the rhythm of it, the familiar crack of rifle fire, the shouted commands that took him back to when his life had purpose. That's when he noticed the commotion at Lane 7. 3 young Marines, couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, were clustered around a table with rifle components spread across it like a mechanical autopsy gone wrong. Their instructor, a sergeant with about 6 years in, stood with his arms crossed, watching with visible frustration. Frank recognized the weapon system immediately. The M27 IAR, the Marine Corps' newer automatic rifle that had replaced the M249 SAW in infantry squads. Beautiful weapon. German engineering, HK416 derivative. Frank had read about it, studied the specs, even watched assembly videos online during his long, empty evenings. "Thompson, it's been 25 minutes, the sergeant barked. "This is basic weapons familiarization. You're making the entire platoon look incompetent." The Marine named Thompson, a lanky kid with sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning, fumbled with the bolt carrier group. "Sergeant, this mechanism is completely different from the M16 system. The manual says—" "I don't care what the manual says. You should be able to field strip and reassemble any weapon system in your sleep. That's what separates Marines from civilians." Frank watched from the observation area, his fingers unconsciously twitching through the assembly sequence he'd performed thousands of times on similar systems. He shouldn't be able to see the range from where civilians were supposed to stay, but he drifted closer, drawn by professional curiosity. The young Marines were making classic mistakes, trying to force components instead of understanding the mechanism, not recognizing the proper orientation of the gas block assembly. "Maybe we should skip to marksmanship training," another Marine suggested, his voice carrying an edge of defeat. "Come back to this later." The sergeant's face darkened. "Negative. We don't move forward until you prove you can handle your weapon system. Colonel Martinez is visiting ranges today, and I'm not having my Marines look like they can't perform basic tasks." Frank had moved without thinking, his legs carrying him closer to the range fence. His better judgment told him to stay back, to mind his own business. Nobody wanted an old man's input. He'd learned that lesson at the hardware store when he'd tried to help a clerk understand torque specifications. He'd learned it at the VA hospital when he'd suggested a different approach to a young doctor. People smiled politely and ignored him. That's how the world worked when you were old. But watching these kids struggle with a weapon system he understood intimately, It gnawed at something deep inside him. The part that remembered being a young Marine himself, overwhelmed and struggling until someone had taken the time to show him the right way. "Excuse me," Frank called out, his voice raspy from disuse but carrying the undertone of command that never quite leaves a military man. "I might be able to help." All 4 Marines turned. The sergeant's expression shifted from frustration to annoyance. "Sir, this is a restricted training area. Civilians need to remain in the observation zone." "I understand, Sergeant. We appreciate your interest in Marine Corps training." The sergeant cut him off, his tone suggesting the opposite. "But these Marines need to figure this out themselves. It's part of their learning process." Thompson, the struggling Marine, glanced at Frank with something between hope and embarrassment. "We've got this, sir. Thank you." Frank started to retreat, but then he saw it. The way Thompson was holding the upper receiver, completely wrong, about to try forcing the charging handle in backward. In another 30 seconds, the kid was going to damage the weapon. Frank had seen it happen before, young soldiers who muscled things instead of understanding them, ending up with broken components and disciplinary action. "Son, you're about to strip those threads," Frank said, his voice firmer now. "The charging handle goes in from the left side, not the right. You're going to—" "Sir," the sergeant stepped forward, his body language shifting to something more aggressive. "I need you to step back right now. This is not a suggestion. You're interfering with Marine Corps training, and that's a serious issue." One of the other Marines, a stocky kid with a thick Boston accent, muttered to his companion, "Great. Now we got random old dudes trying to tell us how to do our jobs. What's next, my grandmother showing up with advice?" They laughed. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind of dismissive chuckling that cut deeper than mockery. Frank felt his face flush, felt the familiar shame of being irrelevant, of being the old man who didn't know when to shut up and disappear. He nodded, taking a step back toward the observation area. His hands were shaking slightly, and he hated himself for that weakness, for caring what these kids thought. "My apologies, Sergeant," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to interfere." He turned away, started walking back toward the civilian area, each step feeling heavier than the last. Behind him, he heard the Marines return to their struggle, heard Thompson curse softly as something clattered to the table. Frank kept walking. This was why he usually just watched in silence. This was why he kept his knowledge to himself. Let the world move on without him. He was almost to the parking lot when he heard the voice. "Frank Morrison." Frank froze. The voice came from behind him, and it carried a quality he hadn't heard directed at him in years, respect mixed with disbelief. He turned slowly to see a Marine officer approaching, his uniform crisp, his rank insignia showing Lieutenant Colonel. The man was perhaps 55, with iron-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of time in combat zones. "Sir," Frank responded automatically, the old protocols kicking in. The lieutenant colonel stopped 3 feet away, his eyes scanning Frank's face with growing recognition. "Gunner Morrison, is that really you?" The word hit Frank like a physical blow. Gunner, his old rank, the one he'd carried with more pride than any other achievement in his life. CWO 4, Chief Warrant Officer 4, Marine Corps Infantry Weapons Officer, a rank so specialized that most people outside the Corps had never heard of it. A rank that meant you were the absolute master of infantry weapons systems, the person that even colonels came to for answers. Yes, Frank managed. "I'm Frank Morrison." The lieutenant colonel's face transformed. He straightened to attention and rendered a sharp salute. "Sir, Lieutenant Colonel David Chen, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. You probably don't remember me, but I was a butter bar lieutenant in 29 Palms in 2004. You ran the infantry weapons officers course. You taught me everything I know about weapons systems." Frank returned the salute, his muscle memory overriding 2 decades of civilian life. "Chen, I remember. You had trouble with the M2 timing, but you got it eventually." Because you stayed 3 extra hours after class, Chen said, his voice thick with emotion. When everyone else had written me off as hopeless with crew-served weapons, you sat with me until I understood the headspace and timing procedures. You saved my career, sir. The sergeant from the rifle range had approached, his expression now uncertain. The 3 young Marines followed, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by confusion. Gunner Morrison, Chen continued, his voice carrying across the range now, is probably the most accomplished weapons specialist in Marine Corps history. He spent 43 years in the Corps. He was the senior enlisted advisor for weapons development at Quantico. He field-tested every major infantry weapon system adopted between 1985 and 2008. The M16A4, the M4, the IAR you're struggling with. Gunner Morrison consulted on all of them. He literally wrote the training manuals you're using. Thompson's face had gone pale. The Marine who'd made the grandmother comment looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. The M27. Chen shook his head in wonder. Sir, didn't you spend 6 months in Germany working with Heckler & Koch on the Marine Corps adaptation? 7 months, Frank said quietly. They wanted to use a different gas system. I convinced them to stick with the short-stroke piston, more reliable in desert conditions. Chen turned to his Marines. Gentlemen, you're looking at a living legend. Gunner Morrison has more confirmed expert qualifications on more weapons systems than probably any person alive. He's a master instructor who trained master instructors. When I was at Quantico, we had a saying, God created infantry weapons, and Gunner Morrison perfected them. Sir, the sergeant said, his voice now respectful but uncertain. We didn't know. How could you? Frank interrupted gently. I'm just an old man watching Marines train. You were doing your job, Sergeant. But sir, Chen said, you could help these Marines. They're struggling with the M27 because we just received them last month. Our unit instructor qualification is still pending. We're learning as we go. He paused, then added with a slight smile. Unless you're too busy to show these young Marines how it's done. Frank looked at the 3 junior Marines. Thompson was staring at him with something approaching awe. The Marine who'd made the crack about grandmothers couldn't meet his eyes. They were so young, so eager despite their earlier bravado. He remembered being that young once, remembered the terror of not measuring up. I suppose I could take a look, Frank said. They returned to Lane 7, and the small group that had formed, Chen, the sergeant, the 3 Marines, and a handful of others who'd heard Chen's proclamation, gathered around the table. The M27 lay there in pieces, a puzzle these young men couldn't solve. Frank stood, before the table, his arthritis protesting as he flexed his fingers. He didn't look at the manual. He didn't need to. His hands moved with a precision that belied his age, each motion economical and certain. The M27 is derived from the HK-416, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of an instructor, which itself is an improvement on the Stoner gas system. The key difference from your M16 is the short-stroke gas piston here. He lifted the component, which keeps carbon fouling out of the bolt carrier group, makes it more reliable in adverse conditions. His hands moved as he spoke. Buffer, spring into the lower receiver. Bolt carrier group, properly oriented, sliding into the upper receiver with a satisfying click. Charging handle, inserted from the left, locked into place. His fingers found each component without fumbling, without hesitation, the movements so practiced they were practically automatic. The handguard assembly locks with these 2 pins, not screws. Common mistake. You push here, he demonstrated, and rotate counterclockwise. The gas block aligns with these grooves, not by force but by proper orientation. 38 seconds in, the upper and lower receivers came together. 41 seconds, the takedown pins snapped into place. 47 seconds, he pulled back the charging handle, inspected the chamber, and set the completed rifle on the table. Complete silence. Every Marine was staring, not just at the assembled weapon, but at the old man who'd made it look effortless. "Now," Frank said, his voice still calm but carrying weight, "let me show you slowly, so you understand why each step matters." For the next hour, Frank Morrison became Gunner Morrison again. He broke down the M27 and reassembled it, explaining each component's function, each potential failure point, each maintenance consideration. The three young Marines hung on every word, asking questions, trying it themselves under his patient guidance. He corrected their errors gently, showed them tricks for remembering assembly sequences, shared insights from his decades of experience. "The weapon is a tool," he told them, "but it's also a responsibility. You need to know it intimately, not just mechanically, but philosophically. Understand what it can do, what it can't do, and respect both." Thompson was the first to successfully complete the assembly under Frank's guidance. His hands shook with concentration, but he got every step right. When the final pin clicked into place, the young Marine looked up at Frank with undisguised gratitude. "Thank you, Gunner," he said. I'm sorry I dismissed you." "You didn't know," Frank replied, "and honestly, I'm just an old man most days. But weapons, I understand." The stocky Marine from Boston, whose name was Kowalski, stepped forward. "Sir, what I said before, about grandmothers, that was disrespectful. I apologize." Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted. But let me tell you something, son. My grandmother fled Poland in 1939 with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's rifle. She walked across Europe, fought with partisans, and survived things that would break most people. Never underestimate grandmothers. They're tougher than you'll ever be." That got a laugh, breaking the tension. Even Kowalski smiled, though his face was still red with embarrassment. Lieutenant Colonel Chen had been watching the entire session, and when Frank finally stepped back, declaring the Marines ready for live fire qualification, Chen approached with a serious expression. "Sir, I'm going to be direct. We have a problem in this battalion. Hell, in the entire Corps. We're transitioning to new weapons systems faster than we can train instructors. We've got gaps in institutional knowledge. We need people like you." Frank shook his head. "I'm retired, Colonel. Have been for 18 years. "I know. But, sir, we have a civilian contractor program for retired warrant officers. Training and consultation. You could work part-time, set your own schedule. Come in when we need expertise on new systems or when we're having trouble with training protocols." Chen's voice dropped lower. "Gunner, I'm not exaggerating when I say you could save lives. Marines who don't understand their weapons properly in combat. That's how people die." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting across the rifle range, watching other Marines train in the distance. He thought about his empty apartment, his silent days, the endless hours of watching life from the sidelines. "I'd have to think about it," he said finally. "Of course. But, sir, please do. We need you. The Corps needs you." Chen extended his hand. "And it would be an honor to work with you again." Frank shook his hand, feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The session ended with the three young Marines qualifying successfully on the M27, their target groups tight and consistent. Frank watched from the observation area, back where he'd started, but everything had changed. The sergeant approached him before leaving, extending his hand. "Sir, I apologize for how I spoke to you earlier. It won't happen again." "You were protecting your Marines and your training area," Frank replied. "That's your job. I respect that. Still, I should have shown more respect." The sergeant hesitated. "Would you be willing to come back? If Colonel Chen's offer works out, we could use someone with your knowledge." Frank found himself smiling, genuinely smiling for the first time in months. "I might just do that, Sergeant." As the sun climbed higher over Camp Pendleton, Frank Morrison stood at the fence line, watching Marines train. But he wasn't just watching anymore. He was part of it again, connected to something larger than himself. The young Marines who dismissed him that morning would remember this lesson, not just about rifle assembly, but about the danger of judging by appearances, about the wisdom that age can carry, about respect. 3 weeks later, Frank started his new position as a civilian weapons systems consultant. He worked 2 days a week, training instructors, troubleshooting problems, and sharing his decades of knowledge with a new generation of Marines. The empty hours that had stretched before him were now filled with purpose. His hands, which had shook with arthritis that morning at the range, steadied when they held weapons. The old muscle memory returned, the old confidence, the old sense that he mattered. Thompson, Kowalski, and the 3rd Marine, a quiet kid named Santos, stayed in touch. They'd send him photos from the field, ask questions about weapon maintenance, update him on their progress. On his desk at home, Frank kept a challenge coin that Thompson had given him, inscribed with a simple phrase, "Never too old to serve." The story spread through the base, then through social media, then beyond. Someone had filmed part of the session, captured the moment when Frank assembled the M27 in less than a minute. The video went viral, with millions of views and thousands of comments. But Frank didn't care about fame. He cared about the young Marines who now understood their weapons better, who carried a lesson about respect and hidden worth, who would pass that knowledge to others. On his 77th birthday, Frank received a letter from the Commandant of the Marine Corps, thanking him for his continued service and dedication. He framed it, hung it next to his old warrant officer commission, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride not just in what he'd been, but in what he still was. Because age might slow the body, but it can't diminish the value of hard-won knowledge, the worth of experience, or the dignity every person deserves. Frank Morrison proved that on a rifle range one November morning, and he continues to prove it every day. He shows up to teach, to serve, and to remind everyone that dismissing someone based on appearances is not just disrespectful. It's a loss for everyone involved. Subscribe to my channel if you believe that every person deserves respect regardless of their age, and that true worth isn't measured by what you can see on the surface, but by the knowledge, experience, and character that lie beneath. Share this story if you've ever been underestimated, or if you've learned the hard way not to judge too quickly. Because the old veteran you dismissed today might be the expert you desperately need tomorrow.